Welcome everybody to Webinar Wednesday. I'm Dr. Pebbles Turbyville. I'm the CEO for Horses and Humans Research Foundation. And I just wanted to give out a shout out about exactly what Horses and Humans Research Foundation is all about. So we give out research grants about how horses help humans, but we also do a section about equine well-being too. But we felt like you just can't do research and put it up on the shelf or put it in a digital file. You really need to educate people. So we started the webinars, and here we are today. And I'm going to pass the baton to Dr. Cheryl Mayola. So she's going to introduce our guest speakers for tonight. Take it away, Cheryl.
Hey guys, so my name's Dr. Miola, and I am thrilled to be the moderator today for a conversation that is long overdue and deeply needed. We're talking about amplifying voices, exploring educational access and support experiences of children with autism, and creating inclusive research teams. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see a title that combines access, autism, and inclusive research, I lean in, and I hope you guys do too, because we have some incredible speakers, and I'm just going to be in the background, stay out of the way unless something goes wildly off the rails. And I got a stopwatch set so we stay on task, have some time for questions, and possibly a Q&A at the end. So speakers, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, take it away.
Tiffany, you're the leader of this project. You're up first.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Tiffany Banks, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County School of Social Work. My field of expertise is in studying the experiences of autistic people and their families. And so I'll turn it over to you, Andrea, to introduce yourself, and then we'll head on in.
Yeah, well, thank you. Evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Andrea Suk, and I am really, really honored to present tonight with Tiffany. I am also an assistant professor, but of inclusive education at Salisbury University in Maryland. Tiffany and I actually met at the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Conference, where I heard her present on this topic, and I said, oh my gosh, we have to get her to present to the HHRF network. And here she is. So I'm super excited. So I joined this presentation as a PATH certified instructor for many, many, many years, and as a person who's currently conducting an inclusive research study. So I will wrap up tonight's webinar with information on how to replicate an inclusive research study.
So just to let you all have a brief overview of what we will be going over in the next hour, right? You can see here clearly we are trying to check a lot of boxes here. So I am first going to start with the overview of some of the research around autism and animal-assisted interventions. And then I'm going to talk about some justification for qualitative methodologies, and specifically focusing on autistic voices. I'll then share just some of the outcomes from my dissertation study that I conducted back in 2023. Before we turn it back over to Andrea to talk a little bit more about expanding that inclusive research team. So without further ado, before I launch into the work today, I did want to just briefly talk about language and positionality. So it's really important to recognize that specifically when we're discussing autism, that this is a particular community which has been embracing identity first language more and more and more over the last few years. And so a lot of us have been trained to utilize what we call person first language, since where you always put the person before the disability or condition, whereas autistic people have embraced the word autistic. And that is coming from a social construction point of view. This idea that disability is something that is created by these external systems, and that autism is not something that they see as wanting to be cured, that it is something that is part of their identity and who they are. So, to center us with some of this positionality, how I see myself doing this work, and how I encourage other researchers to think about doing this work, especially if you are allistic, which refers to somebody who is not autistic, is to always ground your positionality in that of the community you plan to serve. So the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, they are the only autism advocacy organization that is specifically run by people with autism, right? Through all levels of their hierarchy, ASAN employs and serves people with autism. And so back in 2021, they released a white paper that specifically addressed research ethics. And so up on the screen, there's just these four main points from their white paper that guided all of my decision making when I was putting together this project, right? So these are the voices of autistic people saying that, right? When we are studying therapies and services that focus on autism, and that autistic people need to be a core part of the research and developmental team, which I think Andrea will be addressing when she talks about inclusive research teams. They've also said intervention research should address the autistic person's experience of the intervention, including their internal experiences. We'll see what that looks like when I talk about the gaps, when I did some literature reviews on the subject. And then therapies and research should focus on what autistic people want them to focus on. This is their lives, right? And then finally, right, one of the biggest motivators behind the work that I do is that the ASAN asks that qualitative research and non-scholarly writing about autism be just as, if not more, important than quantitative research. And I'm actually going to explain some of the justification behind that, because there's a whole history, right, to how the autistic community has been marginalized and oppressed over our history as a community, right? That I think will help inform why they're making that statement and how we as researchers can embrace that. So I'll just start us off by addressing what we know, right? So I conducted, giant literature reviews during my doctoral program, right? And one of the things that we know is that the empirical evidence is growing, right? We see larger sample sizes, increased methodological rigor, and replication of studies on therapeutic writing that involve autistic participants, just kind of growing and growing and growing. Within that, I just wanted to highlight three core areas of outcomes that are associated with therapeutic writing. We've got our social outcomes, which is the most common type of outcome in this literature, both as a standalone treatment as well as a complement to other empirically supported treatments. We have behavioral outcomes, right? Focusing on decreasing aggression, hyperactivity, increasing executive functioning. And then we have emotional outcomes. And that's that internal experience. If you think back to that white paper that I had mentioned, right, on like, what is that internal experience? What is the actual autistic person feeling? This is the least frequently studied outcome of this literature base, right? And so in my work, I had only 8 studies that addressed emotional outcomes. And that literature review was not therapeutic writing only. That was all animal-assisted therapy, right? So this is an area that is a huge gap for the work that we're doing. In addition, right, I mentioned again that idea that qualitative should be something that is important, right? It's something that it's really valuable in regards to autistic experiences. You can see here blatantly, right? Don't even need to like, just with a glance, you can see how much more quantitative work there is compared to the qualitative work. And in addition to that, right, in this literature review that I conducted here, right, 4 of those qualitative studies were from caregivers and 2 were from providers. There's a big old 0 above participants. So at the time that I had conducted this literature review, there were no qualitative articles that actually interviewed autistic people. They're always the subject of the intervention. They are the participants, but they are not the people that we are collecting data from. And you can see here in the quantitative synthesis as well, right? The actual participants are not typically the people we're collecting that data from. That's a huge gap when we're talking about voice and lived experience and, really knowing what this feels like to the actual person who's riding the horse. So why does this matter, right? I assume that I'm talking to some researchers here, so I'm going to use some of these technical terms, right? Voice matters because of our ontological perspective, right? So my simple explanation of ontology is that it is how we determine, right, what is true and real in this world. I always refer to the old Descartes saying, right, I think, therefore I know, right? That's the kind of philosophical debate within this idea of ontology. So ontology has a huge spectrum, right? We have people who are just realists. They believe that everything can be tested, that there is absolute truth. If you cannot replicate it and generalize it and things of that nature, it doesn't exist, right? Those are realists. And then we have people on the far other side who are relativists. Relativism is this belief that there is no truth. Everything in this world is subjective, right? And what my research showed, right, is that in both from autistic researchers themselves, as well as other non-disabled researchers, is this idea that an ontological perspective of critical realism is really the ontological lens that gives us what truth really means to this community. So critical realism, right, tells us that there are 3 domains of truth. The empirical, right? It's that quantitative data. It's important. What I am talking about today does not negate the fact that rigorous quantitative empirical studies are needed, right? We have to continue growing that base as well. However, let's not forget about these other 2. So the other 2, the actual domain, that is referring to the actual autistic person's experience. These are things that are observable, that the autistic person can relay directly, right? It's their lived experience. So that's that subjective part, the qualitative part. And then on top of that is a domain called the deep. And what the deep is referring to are the things in our society that we cannot observe and see, that we have to give room and credibility to the structural oppression and system interactions that absolutely impact the lives of the people that we're serving. And so ableism, right, or the bias towards people with different abilities is absolutely something that is real and that impacts our work, whether it is a person with autism or without autism, right? Ableism is something that, right, because of this deep domain that we know is experienced kind of across the board. So with that in mind, right, I want to start by saying how I built this project, right? So I thought a lot about who I was as a researcher, how I wanted to fit in with my colleagues. And I knew that as a social worker, what was important to me was to ensure that that voice, that lived experience was always taken into consideration. I know that the history of individuals with autism shows that they have often not been listened to, that they have definitely been the target of eugenics programs. That's where Asperger's came from, right? It's why we no longer use that terminology. It's because of some of its associations. And so I knew that's how I wanted to engage in this work. I also, again, don't want to, neglect the importance of pairing what I'm passionate about with empirical work. And so when I began to figure out what I was going to do, how I was going to do this qualitative work, I partnered with Dr. Robin Gabriels, who is a researcher in Colorado and one of my beloved mentors. Dr. Gabriels has been studying a manualized 10-week therapeutic horseback riding program for nearly a decade, right? So just to give you some of that quantitative empirical evidence of the published work on her programs, right? The first published work was this initial pilot back in 2012. Had a sample size of 42 and showed some reduction in irritability, stereotypic behavior, hyperactivity, and an increase in expressive language. So after that initial pilot, Dr. Gabriels and her team then published an article in 2015 on a randomized control trial. This had a sample of 116, right? So you see that sample size growing. We're collecting more information. Some of the unique things of this 2015 RCT is that the parents reported decreased irritability and hyperactivity. So we're seeing that coming through again. And then in this one, there are blind speech and language pathologists that also confirmed that increase in word usage. So these are individuals who were not aware of, if someone was in the control group or the treatment group. And despite being blind, we still see that the individuals who were involved in the trial group had increased word usage that was statistically significant when compared to those who were in the control group. So this is awesome, right? We're starting to, again, see that methodological rigor increase. Dr. Gabriels and her team then does a 6-month follow-up. So it's the same participants from 2015 who are in this 2018 article. We see a handful of people drop off, so the sample size is now down to 64. But we find sustained outcomes here. So sustained outcomes 6 months after a completion of the therapeutic horseback riding shows that irritability remained decreased and word usage remained increased. So we're seeing that there's some longevity to these outcomes. And then we get to our 2019 study. So this was a very small study that was kind of trialing the addition of cortisol and replicating at a different site. So again, thinking about rigor and methods, right? Saying, okay, so if we move this to another site, are we going to continue to get this? Sample size is really small here. That 2019 study, I will acknowledge, only had 16 participants. It had similar outcomes, wasn't super conclusive, but what it did, I think, was give that research team the opportunity to begin to fold in those physiological measures, right, as a way to sort of get at that internal experience, right? But like my hormones don't necessarily tell me what it feels like, right? Like knowing that my cortisol levels are changing doesn't necessarily directly tell you what I experience. So I love the addition of the physiological measures. It is increasing that rigor, and yet there's still no qualitative part, right? So this research team currently has an ongoing NIH-funded program. They have a goal of recruiting 250 participants across 2 sites in the United States. And so this is why I chose this program to sample from. Right? I specifically knew that wanted my qualitative work to be within a program that had empirical data behind it, because by combining those two things, I think we get the most powerful message, right? We can really say, what's happening here and how do the actual participants feel? So Dr. Gabriels was lovely enough to let me embed my dissertation work into her amazing study. Ideally, of course, if I had the ability to sample across, the multiple years that they will be recruiting for this, I would have, but this was my dissertation. So it is a multiple case study analysis. So I'm going to acknowledge that small sample size and say, right, part of what I'm doing here is confirming what this large pile of empirical data is already saying, right? I'm trying to triangulate, right, the actual lived experiences of the youth with the outcomes of the program. And so I just wanted to know what this experience was like. And so up on the screen, I'm sharing with you some of my favorite quotes, because really what I ended up finding was that the most powerful part of this experience was from the two participants that I interviewed who were in the trial group. And their pseudonyms are up here as Adam and Brian. Adam and Brian both talk about this idea of the horse listening to them being the thing that made them happy, right? I believe that was the word, yes. For Adam, the up high was scary, but what made him happy was his horse listening to him, right? Adam was a young man who was only 6 years old. And so you can imagine, right, being a 6-year-old up on top of this huge giant creature and learning over the course of that experience how to control that. I mean, that is definitely so empowering to recognize that someone can listen to you. And I've had lots of people ask me questions about, like, how reliable is a 6-year-old's comments? Well, when one of the methodologies that you use is inter-member checking, right? We can look at Brian's comment and recognize that this 12-year-old is saying the same thing, right? So for qualitative work, that kind of member checking is helping, right, create some reliability behind this data. So Brian says, it's just because the horse is calm, then I get calm. I guess it feels nice to have somebody who actually listened to me, like fully, Because as a child, nobody really listens to me. A horse does, undeniably. And I think that's really powerful to hear, right? Brian is letting us know that, this not only was a calming experience for him, but he felt heard. When we talk about this idea of uplifting voices, right? Some of the things that Brian talked with me about during this interview was not just having somebody listen to him, but actually feeling heard, which is a completely different experience, right? Active listening is a skill that we use in the clinical world all the time. It's a way of letting somebody know that we're listening to them. And I think for children specifically, right? Brian actually really focused on the idea of being a child, not necessarily being a person with a disability. He felt that being a child was the reason why people didn't actually hear him. And so, I wanted to highlight those important quotes, kind of show you again, how even with this case study analysis, just these few voices, again, are helping us confirm what is already being developed with that empirical evidence. There's a reduction in irritability. Well, Brian's telling you because he feels calm and heard and seen, right? And I think that that's a really powerful experience. So how do you create interview practices with autistic youth? Because as I mentioned, right, this is a group that is sometimes listened to, but not always heard. So a few things played a role in the development of the semi-structured interview. First is something called the double empathy problem. Right? So the double empathy problem is a concept in which um, it is it has been found that people who are autistic gravitate towards other people who are autistic. That the way that they communicate is similar, and so they feel less comfortable in situations where a allistic or non-autistic person is trying to communicate with them. And the reason why that is because autistic people have to code switch, but neurotypical people don't, right? We don't learn how to communicate like an autistic person. We don't adapt ourselves. Instead, we spend all of our time trying to teach these kids how to fit the social norms that society has created. And I'm not saying that's entirely bad, right? There are times and places where, somebody always has the right, um, as part of their self-determined life, right, to choose when they might want to mask or share, right, those sorts of parts of their identity. But it is something that we have to be thinking about as researchers, right? Whether the child is engaging with us fully, feels trusting in that relationship, right? The double empathy problem is definitely something that we need to be considering. In addition to that, right, all qualitative work focuses on this idea of reflexivity and, being engaging in self-reflection throughout the research process. Um, and so this is where that piece around our own ableism and being aware of that comes into play. And I'll use Brian as an example. At one point in time, Brian had said, well, I don't think that the people are really trained in autism because they're not accommodating my need for a schedule. He was very rigid, right? And of course, working with somebody who is incredibly rigid when you have animals involved can be really difficult. Those things don't always go hand in hand. Brian himself was very aware of that. And yet, right, the actions of some of the adults around him made him feel like they didn't understand him. And so engaging in that reflection is really helpful and supportive, right? Particularly because this type of interviewing is not quick interviewing, right? So let me talk through just a handful of these communication techniques. And so for that presentation that Andrea had the privilege of seeing with me, I had kind of broken down communication techniques into these kind of core categories and just talked about what those categories entailed. So the first, executive functioning, attention, language, adaptive functioning, those are all part of that diagnostic criteria. And so just to share a couple of the recommended strategies, right? Semi-structured interviewing is the best choice here because we have to be able to accommodate to the individual. And what that means is allowing for multiple means of expression, right? So I used the zones of regulation because that was something that was already known to all of my participants that allowed us to pair up words, energy levels, colors, right? To just kind of explore if someone said something was scary, right? What does that look like? How scared were you? Were you a yellow zone scared? Were you a red zone scared? Were you like panicking kind of scared, right? So multiple means of expression. Again, just to kind of check that you're understanding because you are recognizing that your communication is different than this youth's. Interviewing in shorter and more frequent blocks, right? If somebody has attention differences, breaking things up into shorter, smaller sections absolutely gives them that accommodation that they might need to take breaks. Reducing stimuli in the interview environment. And that ended up being a super important thing with my friend Adam. He was very different in the two interviews that I did with him. One was an office space, and man, he loved that telephone, right? And the other was a therapy space that was completely blank. And so that ended up being completely different simply because there was no stimuli or distractions in that space. Another is allowing a personal care attendant or advocate. I don't have enough time to go into all the pros and cons, right? But in doing something like allowing an assistant, it is important that we ask the individual with the disability themselves. B, let them choose who that person is, whether it's a parent or somebody else, right? And then three, to always still direct every single question to that person, right? Some of the things that we can see happen if they bring in a parent is that suddenly now the parent is answering all of our questions, right? So we have to put up really strong boundaries and maybe even debrief and talk with that personal care attendant before going into that interview to ensure that everything is still directed back to that child with a disability. And then the last technique or communication technique I wanted to mention here is checking for understanding. So paraphrasing, interparticipant member checking and confirmation, those sorts of activities to ensure that you are understanding the words that they are using and the way that they are using them. Because this is, right, a disability that comes with social communication and social emotional differences. So does the word scary mean the same thing to me as it does to you? I don't know unless I, use these multiple means and check for understanding in different ways. So the last thing I wanted to mention is that, again, right, what drives my work and the reason why this is important is the voice of this community. So when we're talking about autism research in today's climate, I wanted to share this joint statement that was issued by all of the leading autism organizations, right? Evidence-based policy is best. So again, we want that empirical evidence. That stuff is important. And autistic individuals deserve respect and support. And so when we're talking about doing this kind of work, it is more essential than ever that we keep doing inclusive research practices and that we recognize some of those gaps. So just put a few references and resources, just a handful of the most important ones to what I talked about today. And that concludes. I will go ahead and pause and see if there are any questions before turning it over to Andrea.
The only thing we have in the chat is Andrea saying that this discussion has made me reflect a lot on a few current situations.
Oh, I love that. Reflection is like so essential.
Yeah, no, there's been a few situations that I've come across just this week and even today that I'm like, okay, I could have done that better based on what I'm learning from this webinar. I wasn't totally off base, but I'm like, oh, I should have done this a little differently in this situation. So I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right.
Well, we did just get a quick question, if that's okay,
Yes,
from Elaine.
please.
And is sensory input from mounted work necessary for sustained gains, or is unmounted work as helpful?
That is a very excellent question. So in the follow-up study, and I don't have it in front of me, but the focus was on that mounted work. So I'm not sure if unmounted work would have the same outcomes. I think, the idea that sensory input might be one of the essential features is definitely a solid hypothesis, but I don't know that that has necessarily been explored, at least in the literature that I reviewed.
I think that's it. We got to thank you.
All right, everybody. Well, to wrap up tonight, this is meant to be short and sweet, but it is a big conversation, and I'm really hoping just to plant the idea for everyone. And the idea is that to create an inclusive research team on your future adventures in research. So this is just a brief overview of the benefits of creating inclusive research teams. And I know people on this line are both leaders in the creation of studies, but I also know that this audience, just by being here, you are excellent consumers and look for quality research. And so I hope that the next few slides on this overview either sparks ideas on how you can create inclusive research teams, but to also consider when you are looking at publications and having this be a part of potentially your judgment of a quality research study and a publication about it. So first and foremost, what is this inclusive research team that I speak of? Well, an inclusive research team is this collaborative group that intentionally expands what that traditional research team would look like to also include individuals who would be the focus of your study as a participant, as a subject, but to include them not as participants or subjects, but instead as members in your research team. Now, these new members may not have advanced degrees. They might not have any formal research in training or ethics in research, but they bring the valuable lived experience that informs and enriches our research process. Additionally, they contribute to this creation of knowledge, not just as being the subjects of something studied, but elevating their voice because they are partners within the research. I pause to go next. So, in thinking about creating these types of research teams, it's important to consider how do we make sure that we have diverse voices at the table? And this can mean individuals with various backgrounds for race, ethnicity, gender, disability, disciplinary training, and even the career stage. We can absolutely expand, but my focus is specifically with youth who have a disability. And so I will provide some examples later on tonight on the current project that I'm on and challenges that we've overcome in creating our first attempt at an inclusive research team. But we actively started to recruit members who bring these lived experiences to the research topic. And as a team, we sat down and we had a shared decision-making discussion on how do we share what we're thinking? What if there is a conflict in what we choose to do on the research questions and moving forward? Um, but it's also really important for those teams to pause and recognize and address that there are probably going to be these power imbalances. Generally speaking, many research teams are made up of people with their PhDs, either as scientists in private laboratories or in academia. And at least in my experience of creating an inclusive research team, my individuals that I've been working with, they don't have their PhDs, they don't work in laboratories. And so we don't want to set up a structure that, oh, it's only going to be the professor with 30 years of experience who has the say on everything, because that totally negates what an inclusive research team is. It's to have this shared voice where everyone can speak and is heard and is respected. We also want to pause and really reflect on our own biases and privilege, as well as barriers. And the barriers piece has been really hard for me because not living that experience myself, I haven't recognized or lived through a lot of those barriers. And so being on this team, I am becoming very aware of barriers that I didn't even know existed, and maybe I should have, right? So we'll go to the next slide. Another piece of this puzzle is considering who we're expanding our research teams to have the discussion about accessibility as well as accommodations. A lot of universities use what's called city training as a platform to teach about ethics in research. Whether it's with humans or animals, you typically have to go through these modules that take hours and hours and hours. I can testify to that on all of these very important things to make sure that we are ethical researchers and we're not harming people. Well, this online platform is great for some. It is often required by the IRBs to approve any study before it can start. Unfortunately, city training does not have any accommodations built into their platform unless you have a vision disability or a hearing disability. So if you have any type of cognitive disability where potentially the 12 plus grade reading level is not something that is accessible to you, there is no way for you to access this material. And so in my context of the study, there was really no way for a person with an intellectual disability to go through city training independently, like any of other researchers would. Additionally, we want to plan to make sure that our meetings, materials that we're using, and tools are fully accessible. And that might look at using plain language, ASL interpreters, screen readers to make sure all of our documents are friendly. And so I'll even depict an example a little later. And then finally, being able to adapt to the communication and participation needs of all team members. When are their availabilities? Seems like an easy place to start. But maybe they prefer to meet in person compared to Zoom because Zoom adds another layer of challenge for communication of, trying to find the unmute button. That's a struggle for some people, including myself, right? And so eliminating some of those barriers to help our new researchers feel comfortable in the process is something that we should pause to consider. Next. And this one is huge. I know none of us conduct research to make the money, right? Because there's money out there to conduct research, but not a whole lot of money goes back into the people who are actually researching. So when we think about adding more members to our research team, it's really good to pause and think about the compensation factor. In my experience, right, I'm a professor. It's expected that part of my time is built into research. And until the budget cuts and crunches everywhere, there was even, a pot of money for me to access for research, right? But if you're not part of that academia world or that scientific laboratory world, you don't have access to those funds easily or at all. And so pausing to think, okay, if I'm writing a grant, how can I make sure that I budget for stipends or wages to compensate members who are new to our research team? Especially thinking about individuals who have an intellectual disability. We know through research that most of them do not have jobs, period. If they do, usually not full time and usually at minimum wage. And so when we think about that in the context of, oh, I'm going to go to a conference and present, you've seen the prices of conferences. I mean, easily $400, $500, $600 just for registration, then $1,000 for the hotel. And that's not counting the plane or the food or anything else. And so while that can be a big swing for even a new professor, somebody that's working part-time at minimum wage, that's not fair or equitable to ask of our team members. So really planning ahead of how do we support them through that compensation piece. Also thinking about down the road, we want to publish this, right? So how is the order of authorship going to be discussed and determined, as well as the order of presenters? We want to make sure that all team members that are involved in the research get credit for what they're doing. And depending on what field you're in, there may already be some outlines and best practices in this area. For example, APA says basically whoever's idea it is probably going to be the first author. But even that has kind of changed and progressed now into today's world, that it's really up to that research team. Some teams will go by whose idea it was. Some teams will go by who put the most work into the research or that writing publication. And sometimes, if it's a long-standing research team that has a lot of trust and respect with each other, they will switch around who is first author based on who's going up for promotion next. So it's really kind of dependent on that team and their trust. Finally, on this slide, it talks about this dissemination of the information. Yes, we love to have the publications. It's in writing, it's peer reviewed, somebody else has signed off on it that says this is high quality research. But for a lot of members in the community, and I know one of HHRF's purposes is to disseminate research to those who don't necessarily always have access to that publication behind a paywall. And that's great, right? But a lot of our communities still don't get knowledge from writing and from scientific papers. And so thinking about how can we share information in community forums, videos, infographics, plain language. So this way it also gets back to the population that is the focus of our study and what they can benefit from this. Next. This will go pretty quick on this slide, but some things to really remember when starting up an inclusive research team. And number one is to avoid tokenism. We don't, first off, want to include somebody just to check a box. You know, we don't want it to be symbolic. If we're going to include somebody, they are part of our research team just like anybody else. Additionally, this also means that while we're inviting new researchers on the team that would have traditionally been participants, that doesn't mean they can speak for everybody who has autism or everybody who has Down syndrome or everybody who's a veteran, right? It is still their lived experience and we get to amplify their voice, but we also have to recognize they are one voice, right? So it's also having that knowledge piece to it. We talked about, again, that power imbalance, that we want to try to fight against that, acknowledge it, and do things to address it. So it's, again, not just, oh, that person has researched for 30 years, they must know best. That might not be the case. To set up transparency of who will be a tiebreaker or a voice if there is a dispute within the team. And then to offer training and mentorship in meaningful ways, not just something, again, to check a box or something that patronizes somebody. All right, we'll go on to the next one. So this is perfect timing because this will still give us time for some questions at the end, but I like just to highlight for a moment my current experience because, man, I have had so many eye-openers with this research study. So the research study is interviewing individuals who have an intellectual disability about their lived experiences. So this is, again, very qualitative, and we are specifically focusing on young men and women who have an intellectual disability and their thoughts related to relationships. Have they dated somebody before? Have they kissed anybody before? Do they want to be married? And within this field, the research shows that, first off, most of the time, people think that this group is asexual and they have no desire to have a relationship whatsoever. Well, that is completely false. We're going to throw that out there right now. So most of them, like the majority of all other humans, do desire to have some sort of a relationship. And what that looks like can be very different for everybody. The other thing that we have found through research is that in this population of people, there is so much scrutiny and security to keep them safe that they often have barriers to even have any of these types of experiences. You know, if you're living in a group home and you're always surrounded by staff, you're probably not going to have any time to play smoochy face with anybody or anything else, right? So we recognize that these are big barriers, and we wanted to understand, well, what are the people with an intellectual disability really thinking and feeling about this? As we started kind of brainstorming this idea, I decided to reach out to a young man, 26 years old, on our college campus with Down syndrome. I wanted to figure out if he would like to join our research team. I had known him previously, and he's always been interested in expanding his knowledge and continuing to read and write and learn more about the world. And so when he heard about this opportunity, I mean, he jumped on it. He was like, yes, I want to be a part of the research team, right? And I was like, okay, we're going to figure everything else out from this point forward. And then that came to city training right away. Like, we have to get you city trained because that's the only thing that's out there. And it was an absolute nightmare. Um, None of the materials were accessible for him. So I pulled out my college teaching hat again and said, I guess I have to redesign city training. And I sat there for hours and then worked with him to make sure that every module he could go through, and I was there to support him and explain all of those details of what the modules were saying at a very high level, and trying to break it up and chunk it so that he had access to that. So that was not fun, to be honest with you. I would not want to redo city training for anything, but it was important that he had that certification. So once he did, we all sat down as a team to discuss our research questions. What are we going to ask participants? And this was one of my aha moments. We had the questions of, do you want to be married? Have you ever been on a date? And we kind of listed 10 of them, and we're throwing ideas back and forth. And this young man goes, well, wait, you didn't ask who supervises them or chaperones them on a date. We had so many PhDs in that room, and not one person thought of that question. And it was that aha moment of like, it's never been our lived experience. But for most individuals with an intellectual disability, if they're allowed to date, they have to be chaperoned. And follow up to that, when we asked that question to our participants, none of them had a question on what does that mean. They all instantly knew who was their chaperone for dates. We would have totally missed that entire conversation and research point if it wasn't for our inclusive team member. We have just now finished coding the transcripts. And so that has also been kind of an interesting process where I have taught our new researcher how to use highlighters and color coding to move away from the sometimes overburden of too much worded language or written language. So that has been also kind of an interesting way that we're still seeing amazing results just by making some small tweaks for accessibility. And finally, yes, we have hit the funding barrier. So I don't have a grant for this, right? And I only have, I'll be totally honest with you, like $400 left in my budget to travel to present at conferences. And that is now getting eaten up to go to this one last conference in June. But unfortunately, this young man is not part of faculty. And so going around campus asking about what other funds are available for a non-faculty member to present research, people looked at me like I had three heads. Like, what are you talking about? Why would a non-faculty member present research? And so then it was, well, maybe you should go outside the university, which also felt kind of weird because this young man worked for the university with us. And so asking regional and state disability groups for funding. Of course, everybody's on a budget crunch, so came back, no, no, no. Well, we finally did find a pot of money at the university to support him because, again, we don't want that to be a barrier for him. So next. I wanted to share a few of the research and references and resources, excuse me. The first one I think is worth its weight in gold. The Research Ethics for All is a new version that basically takes city training and makes it accessible to a lot of people. I can't say everybody, but it has a lot of different accommodations and accessibility features that if I had known that this was in creation, I might have waited to do our research study and not gone through city, because that's how good it is. And then within the education field, this topic of inclusive research has only really been discussed in the past like 2, 3 years, but it's actually been around a lot longer than that. Some of the articles that I share here, they're 10 plus years old, just not from the field of education. So it feels like education is just catching on that this is a good idea. But these are a few articles that I thought were really good on the reflections of creating and working in an inclusive research team and how to set up a shared decision-making metric to make sure that everybody's voices are heard and respected. So that concludes my brief overview. I know there was a couple of things going on in the chat. So we have one person that said that they were learning a lot. Oh, good. That makes me happy. That they have had a lifelong relationship with horses and my daughter's work with autistic children. Excellent. That makes me so happy. One of the other questions that came up, is it useful to incorporate researchers that have worked with animals to better observe or be sensitive to nonverbal or other ways of expressing their experiences? Kathy, I'm assuming you're asking if a animal researcher should participate and give feedback on human participants. Am I reading that correctly, Kathy? Okay. Um, I can't necessarily comment too much on it. I think that, again, they could bring a very interesting perspective. Tiffany, has any of your research crossed over into that?
So I have a couple of thoughts on that question. Um, One, I think it's a great question, particularly if you've read Temple Grandin's work, right? Dr. Grandin talks a lot about her hypothesis on that overlap and her relationship as an autistic researcher and things like that. So I think that it's a valid question. My gut though says, let's remember that we're still talking about people, and that all autistic people have very unique presentations and expressions of their autism. And so when we're talking about nonverbal and other means of expression, I think there's actually other ideas that would first come to mind for me, like engaging with a speech and language pathologist or other individuals who are involved in the care of that specific child, right? Because what somebody is communicating by their words and or completely non-verbally might be unique to that child. And so their parent might have some insight. Their providers outside of the study might have some insight, right? And so I think that calls to me more than incorporating someone who's worked with animals, because what signs of stress look like in different animals isn't necessarily the same as how that person might be expressing it.
Yeah, I thank you for that. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can now.
Sorry, I was muted. But just the whole thought process that you're if you've worked a lot with animals, like in a training mode or day-to-day husbandry, you pick up on those behavioral, attitudinal, even expressions within the limitations that they have that suggest something is different than normal for them, or there is a different type of feeling that they're having. Sorry, humanization there, but I do think they have feelings. But
Yeah, no, I agree.
it's kind of along the same lines that, you know, and you've already acknowledged Temple Grandin as a fantastic person in this area. Her ability to see the squeeze chute used for cattle and think about the application to herself in relieving the anxiety. I'm not sure that, in my experience of working with cattle and squeeze chutes, it's not always an anti-anxiety tool for them, but it was an interesting connection that she was able to make. And if somebody's been more accustomed to working with, and I'll say it loosely, clients that are not as verbal in their expression, they may be more sensitive to some of those more subtle cues. I 100% agree that it's still important for us to acknowledge the autistic individual themselves and try to draw that expression out from them as much as we possibly can, because it's quite possible that what they're experiencing is totally different than what we imagine just from observing or asking others that are familiar with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So are you guys good with wrapping up, or do we have another question coming through? I see that Tiffany and Andrea shared their contact info in the chat if you guys want to write that down. I think we can all agree that this was a really important conversation. We do have one more question that came in if you guys want to stay, are willing to stay on for another minute, from Heather.
Yeah, that is a great question, Heather. On the education side, if you hear about research that's popping up, I always get flyers of, we need participants for this, we need participants for that. They always have a contact number. So that's always one way to reach out and say, hey, is this an inclusive research team? Are you looking to add to the team? Knowing at that point, it's probably a little late, right? Because they have already created their research questions. They already have an established team, but it might be some way to expand their knowledge, redo some of the research, or the next project that comes up. That's one way, because again, the researchers that I typically have to work with, we live by the theme of publish or perish. So it's not like we stop. We just have to keep going. And so whether we have something current or we know of another person that does, I think just asking that question on any of those research flyers that you see coming around, and also reaching out to local universities going, hey, if you have a program established, not only would we love to host research, but we would also like to be a part of the research team. So that's one way. And Terry has one on here that the EGALA model is experiential teaming with horses as a metaphor for personal growth and healing. Horses interact within their herd much like humans will. Thank you. Yes.
I think horses may be more effective in their communication in the herd setting than people. Sorry, just a little personal observation there.
Well, thank you guys so much.
So much. This is one of my favorite talking points, sharing this information from autistic self-advocates with researchers. And I really appreciate everyone's participation today and your dedication to this community and this work. And so thank you.
And thank you for presenting. That was really educational and inspiring for sure.